You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 440 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I have all the updates about Trump's assassination of Iranian Quds Force General Soleimani, and I also want to touch on some stories going on in Africa, including the death of 3 American military personnel in Kenya, and a major shift in the battle lines in Libya. Alright everyone, please take the time to share the show. I know I got huge positive reception on the last show. I saw it shared all over the place. I got, several emails telling me how much people liked the show, which was awesome. So, I'm just really excited that means everybody's actually going out there and sharing the show. And I do really appreciate it. And, trust me, it is helping the show to grow. When everybody is going around and sharing it, more people are listening and, help spreading this anti-war message that I have. So I really appreciate it. You find it online at the Libertarian Institute. I'm the news editor there, and I write the daily news roundup. So pretty much any work I do can be found there. Subscribe to the show somewhere. Most of what I do on the show is updating current events. So go to iTunes or wherever your favorite podcast app is, and make sure you hit the subscribe button. And if you can, give me a rating and review. And last, if you really like the show and want to be a donor, think about going on over to patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus and donating a few bucks to help the show out. So about as soon as I finished recording the podcast, the news broke that Iran had actually responded to the assassination of Soleimani. And so I hopped back on. I'm recording this little segment, and then I will hop into the actual show from here. But I do want to update what happened because it does impact what I talk about on the show. And I do get some analysis on what I think the Iranian response will be. So the attack came at about 1 a.m. on January 8th in Iraq. The time of the attack was apparently synced up pretty closely to the U.S. assassination of Soleimani, as far as like 1 a.m.-ish hour. According to the Pentagon, the attack from Iran included more than a dozen short-range ballistic missiles fired at the Al-Assad air base in Iraq. This is the base that Donald Trump was tweeting about that the U.S. had spent all that money on and that we were going to sanction Iraq over before we left. It houses U.S. soldiers if the Iraqis were actually able to push U.S. troops out. So that base was definitely hit. There's reports that a second base was hit. As of the recording of this show, I can't nail that down, but definitely it seems the Al-Assad base was hit. There's various reports of how accurate the missile strikes were, what was hit if the missiles did hit the base, and what, if any, casualties there are. As of this time, there are no reports of American casualties, and there are some reports of Iraqi casualties. I can't really comment on what the American response to this and what Trump may do from here, just because there's not enough information out yet on the actual damage from the attack. After the attack, Iran immediately started putting out statements saying that if the U.S. responded, that they would respond back. I believe they said they would hit all bases housing U.S. soldiers within the region, and they would directly attack any country where the U.S. launched an attack from. So we launched an attack from the air base in the UAE. Iran is threatening to attack Dubai. That's kind of the game that they're playing. They also had the representative of the Ayatollah on Twitter, because the Ayatollah's account is suspended, put out a tweet of the Iranian flag, which is, what Trump did. So I think one thing I could say about the attack so far is it seems Iran attempted very much to ally what they did with what the U.S. did with Soleimani, making similar statements after. Who knows where we go from here? We could still hope and pray for the best. If you watched Tucker Carlson's show tonight, which is something apparently Donald Trump watches, he put a lot of people up there on his show. Gil Barndollar, Kelly Vallejos, Colonel Douglas McGregor, all saying that a wider war isn't what the U.S. needs It certainly isn't what Trump's reelection needs. So with that, I'll go ahead and get into the analysis on the show. With the thing saying, I did leave my analysis on what Iran's response may be in there, even though I do specifically say I don't think that they would carry out a direct attack against the U.S. I decided to leave it in there because I thought the rest of the analysis may still be relevant, and depending on what was actually hitting this Iraqi base, I am still surprised that, Iran fired missiles even at the Iranian base or at the Iraqi base. I thought for sure they would, act in some way that's maybe one step removed, but this was, a direct Iranian retaliation. So, unlike something like the strike on Aramco, any of the potential damage or bombings of different ships in the Persian Gulf, any shelling of Iraqi bases by Iraqi PMFs, all that stuff, there's a kind of a level of deniability. With this, there wasn't. Iran came right out and said we did. So I think that's kind of the, the one step more. But overall, I think the analysis is still okay. And, I guess, just so all of you know my thoughts, and I don't want to try to hide anything, even when I don't occasionally predict everything that's going to happen, in all these wars. I just, try to bring you my honest thoughts. So here's the rest of the show. All right, so as I was mentioning, I got a huge positive reception on the last show, and what I did is I had Scott Horton on the show to explain who Soleimani was, why the U.S. killed him, and all the background and lies being told, because I really wanted to arm myself and my audience with all the knowledge needed to go out there and take on all the neocons on Facebook, especially the surprising number of libertarian, apparently, neocons that I'm finding. People who, I know are legitimately good when it comes, to, police abuse, drug legalization, taxes, stuff like that. They're all on board for it. And then suddenly, they're supporting this act of war by Donald Trump. It's absolutely shocking. And so, to have all that information that I got Scott to, give me and the rest of my audience is huge. So if you haven't listened to this show, go back and check it out. On the show, we kind of detailed what we knew at the time, and I think we recorded the podcast pretty close to 48 or 24 hours after the strike happened. So the details we had were pretty scarce, and I really didn't want to focus on, that aspect of it too much. So I got quite a bit more on today's show. So it seems like the actual details of this are Soleimani flies into the Baghdad airport and meets the deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces. They hop in 2 vehicles and take off. And I can't tell if there were 2 vehicles and only 1 was targeted, or there were 3 vehicles and 2 were targeted. But either way, it seems like at least 1 vehicle wasn't hit and at least 1 was, killing both Soleimani and the deputy commander of the Popular Mobilization Forces, Abdul Mahdi al-Muhandis. And so as me and Scott explained on the last episode of the show, Soleimani is this military general hero figure, somebody who defeated the Islamic State. So, it's not really right to compare him to Mattis or Esper, who's the head of the Secretary of Defense, or whoever, Mark Milley or somebody like that. It's much more like a Dwight Eisenhower who went and conquered the Nazis, or, a General Patton who won, a war. So, this guy Soleimani is big. But also the other guy who was killed, who has gotten just far, far less focus, Muhandis, I believe, deputy commander of all the Popular Mobilization Forces, is also a war hero in Iraq. And while he may not have the stature of Soleimani, I think he is a very prominent military figure. And so I think maybe more of a Petraeus or a general that, Americans actually know the name of, or a Mattis is kind of the equivalent here. So understand that that's what the United States did on Iraqi soil. Those are the people killed. Now there's some question, and this is something that Elijah Magnier has pointed out, and he was just on my good friend Joanne Leone's show, Around the Empire. She did a fantastic episode with him, so I'll link to that in the show notes page as well, because I'm getting a lot of what I'm talking about here from that episode. But he said that it's usually Muhandis's chief of secretary or security, that would actually go and meet Soleimani in the past, and that guy just happened to be out of the country, so he went himself. And that's the reason he was killed, that was kind of unintentional by the U.S. That's just the reporting there. But anyways, major event in the Middle East. So it does seem like this was a drone strike. I saw some conflicting reports whether it was a drone or a helicopter strike, but it does look like it was a drone strike, and at least 2, if not 3, missiles were fired. And then, this was a pretty intricate mission by the Americans. It seems that they did pick a target where there weren't civilians in place on a road outside the Baghdad airport. And they had helicopters either in the air or on the ground ready to go nearby, because shortly after the drone strike, they were on the ground to collect DNA evidence to ensure that the person that they had killed was Soleimani. All right, so I guess I will mention too, and I think it's worth it, that Soleimani and Muhandis, their funerals and celebrations of their lives, for Soleimani both in Iraq and Iran, and for Muhandis just in Iraq, have been absolutely massive crowds. This is one of the things that Pence and Pompeo pointed to after the drone strike, was there's people in the street celebrating the death of these men, which was, definitely true. I mean, these are military leaders. I've talked in the past on the show about the war crimes committed by the Shia militias when they were fighting alongside the Americans. Allegations of ethnic cleansing, certainly assuming that pretty much any, Sunni military aged men was either potentially or likely a member of the Islamic State. And I'm sure there were an awful lot of people that were unnecessarily killed, in their fighting, and they're taking the country back from the Islamic State. And so, it's not like these people are saying so nobody is trying to make that point, but it is very important to understand who these men were from the perspective of their countrymen, the Iraqis and the Iranians. Because it may not seem substantial to a lot of Americans, and especially when the administration puts up some signal saying, Soleimani has killed a lot of Americans in the past, Pence saying they were involved in 9/11. These lies debunked on the last show I did with Scott Horton, but, also pointing out that he was a present danger or imminent danger to Americans, and that he was playing on attacks on them is enough for Americans to say, oh, well, it was worth it. But understand this was a violation of Iraqi sovereignty. They did not approve this airstrike. They absolutely wouldn't have let it happen had they known about it and could have prevented it. And as we'll talk about in the show, the Iraqis are quite upset. So I want to talk a little bit about, what the reporting is behind this. And that is, it was Mike Pompeo was the major pusher in the Trump administration for this. There's various reports around this, so I don't want to get into too much of the details, because the stories conflict and it's hard to tell which general or which details exactly are right or wrong. But it does seem like a pretty consistent reporting that Pompeo was the major pusher for this, and that at one point in time, Trump was presented with a series of options to take against Iran, and this was the most extreme option. And at some point, he then decided to do this. It's not, I've seen that this was the most extreme option in response to the killing of a U.S. contractor, or that this was, several months ago, maybe as a response to the shoot down the U.S. drone possibility. And then once the contractor was killed, Trump decided to do this. I'll continue to, wait and report on it as it comes out on the show, how that decision was made in the Trump administration. I'm unfortunately seeing some of the, pro-Trumpers, first of all, try to absolve him of this by saying, oh, it was Pompeo and Pence who did it. And, look at all the warmongers around the guy's trying to fight the swamp and overcoming him. But he's the president of the United States. He makes the calls here. And so the responsibility is on Trump. I'm also hearing some people say, oh, this is, 60 or 70 or however many D's you need to have, to possibly believe that what Donald Trump was trying to do here is go so far that it provoked this reaction from the Iraqis where they tell the Americans to leave and we have no choice but to do it. It absolutely seems ridiculous to me that was Trump's goal here. Now, it may play out that way in the long run, but I don't think that's what Trump's aiming at here. So a big part of the American justification that came out, right after the strike was that he presented an imminent threat to Americans and was in Iraq either to carry out or plan attacks. First of all, it seems questionable why you would maybe target Soleimani here, because he's not going to be on the front line shooting at Americans. He's not going to wear a suicide vest into an Iraqi base and blow himself up. He's not going, probably won't be the guy, lobbing mortars at the U.S. or anything like that. He's not a front lines fighter, right? And so to, pretend like he was in the process of going to carry out an attack seems pretty untrue. And in fact, once, Mike Pompeo took to the Sunday shows, I guess, to do rounds like Susan Rice did after Benghazi, he waffled on this a little bit and, used this definition of, imminent and threat to Americans that, well, eventually he was going to do something. There's a New York Times reporter, Ruki Mini Kalamachi, and I'm really sorry for butchering this lady's name who did some good work here, has a very good Twitter thread, which will be linked in the show notes page. But on that Twitter thread, she kind of points out that the, thinking of the Trump administration here is that, well, Iran's been threatening lately and we say that they've carried out all these attacks in the past and killed Americans in the past. And since we're kind of in a conflict with them, well, that's good enough to say that they're planning an imminent attack. And so then, she, uses this term that's been repeated, and I think it's a pretty good clarification of what it's razor thin if it exists at all. The line the Trump administration is trying to walk here to say that Soleimani presented an imminent threat to Americans. This is something that came out at the time, and I saw a lot on Facebook, people saying, oh, this is why they labeled the IRGC as a terrorist organization so they could do this. I thought it was pretty unlikely that they would use the 2001 AUMF to take out Soleimani here, and it doesn't seem like they're invoking that yet, but it's very important to remember that that does exist, and it's something that I think the U.S. and Trump administration could fall back on if it leads to a little bit of a wider proxy shooting war between Iraq and Iran and the Middle East. And so it's extremely important for Congress to take up this issue right now and repeal the 2001 AUMF before Trump does anything too stupid with it. Daniel Larison has a really good write-up on this whole imminent threat thing, and I will link to that in the show notes page. He also goes over how Trump pretty much lacks any legal authority to have carried out this strike. So it seems like, time for abuse of power. Congress is going to take up the issue, right? I mean, this is something that could have provoked the United States into war, not cutting off a couple $100 million to a military that has neo-Nazi elements to it. This is a very serious issue and one they really should be taking more of a stance on. The Democrats are kind of, half of them are saying, well, it's good that Soleimani's dead. And, Trump should have talked to me first, so I could have told him to go ahead and do it. But, I'm glad Trump did it. And then you have a half saying, well, Trump shouldn't have done this. It might provoke a wider war. But mainly they're concerned about the procedural thing. Like, that's the big issue that they have. And then at the end, they kind of do this and they say, but, Soleimani was a really bad guy and I don't want to defend him or say that he shouldn't be dead. I'm not going to shed any tears. So blah, blah. Anybody who's like me, concerned about the death and didn't want Soleimani to die, it's not because I'm shedding tears for Soleimani. It's because, I'm shedding tears for the people of the Middle East. All these innocent people who will be caught up in the middle if the United States carries out war against Iran. Imagine the sanctions regime shutting down, and making oil transportation more difficult out of the Persian Gulf, bombing innocent civilians. All this is going to happen if the U.S. ends up as a shooting war. So, it's not tears that I'm crying in any way for Soleimani, but, it does make me very, very concerned that this could lead to a wider conflict and kill an awful lot of people who don't deserve to be killed, who have every right to just be able to live their lives free of the American empire. It's very interesting. On the day, I believe, after the strike, the Department of Homeland Security released a statement saying that there was no threat to the U.S. homeland. So it seems to undercut the Trump administration a little bit here, right? Like, if there's an imminent threat to America and it's just for our troops in Iraq where, we've declared defeat against ISIS at this point, so why not just take the troops out? Why put them there for targets for Iranians? At this point, it seems like the U.S. could leave, and that would be very much in line with Trump's American First policy. Now, there is one big story that I've seen reported, and Elijah Magnier has talked about it, and it seems to me to be true. At least in part of what Soleimani was doing in Iraq was to deliver a message to some kind of intermediary, to Saudi Arabia. So what's going on is, I believe in part at the request of Donald Trump, the Iraqis are trying to mediate some kind of at least reduction in tensions, if not outright deal between the Saudis and the Iranians to scale back the hostilities that really only started up because Trump withdrew from the, nuclear deal in the first place. So the obvious solution here is just to get back within the nuclear deal and reduce sanctions on Iran and tell Iran, please do the same. And Saudi Arabia, as a part of that process, had sent some kind of offer to the Iranians through the Iraqis, and Soleimani was in Iraq to deliver the response to at least the Iraqi intermediary, if not directly to the Saudis. If this is true, and the U.S. decide to kill him on this trip, that has some really disturbing layers to it. At least let the guy deliver the message first. I mean, it's in the U.S.'s own interest to have Iran and Saudi Arabia get along in the Middle East. I mean, our goal is to, quote unquote, stabilize the region. Well, that's the most stabilizing thing possible. Trita Parsi has a really good article on this, how it seems like the most diplomacy that's happened in the Middle East happened not when the United States is as most hawkish, like right now, when we're killing the potential intermediary, but rather when the U.S. and Trump were, while being very hawkish, also sending some signs that the Trump administration would not engage in a, shooting war with Iran on behalf of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. We had, some drawdown and reduction in Saudi and Emirati forces in Yemen. The UAE seemed to generally lighten their tone and position on Iran. There were, looks to kind of restabilize the GCC and end the Saudi and UAE, Bahrain, Egyptian blockade of Qatar. Some normalizing of relations with the Saudi. Like, all this kind of stuff is going on during the times where Trump is, and I'm not trying to say that Trump is actually going to bring all the troops on or anything, but sometimes he says things that if you're an ally dependent on U.S. security is going to make you act a lot less hawkish if you hear him say it, because you don't know if Trump and the Americans, and for the Saudis and for the Israelis to fight a war against Iran, they need American support. I mean, I think the, Israelis have a nuclear arsenal and they have a superior military to the Iranians, but there's 80 million Iranians. They have a lot of support throughout, different regions in the Middle East because the United States, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Turkey, Israel has waged aggressive campaigns in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and Yemen, creating the instability that Iran was unable to, try to capitalize on and stabilize and, turn the tides more in their favor. Well, in the process of that, they've, harmed and killed a lot of people, and they also have helped a lot of people. So now they have a lot of support. And so for, any of these countries to try and pick a fight with Iran in the region, that they're likely picking a larger fight as well. And that includes the Americans, where you would have to worry about U.S. forces not only stationed in Iraq or, in Qatar or the UAE, but also in Syria, Afghanistan, and just about everywhere else. Anyways, assuming this is true, which it seems to be, just to point out to the Iraqi prime minister in his address to parliament, he's, currently in a caretaker's role. The protesters pushed him to resign, but he is still the prime minister, at least in name, said that Soleimani was on his way to deliver this message as well. Now, I think maybe a discrepancy here is, I'm guessing that's not the only thing the guy was in Iraq for. He may have had some other things that he was doing, and those may have been more directed towards the Shia militias. All right, Iran has named the Quds Force deputy, so I'm assuming this is Soleimani's number 2, Ismail Ghani, as the new commander of the Quds Force. I don't know anything about this guy yet, other than he's been close with Soleimani for some time, and a lot of people are, kind of just saying that he's going to step in and fill the role of Soleimani pretty well. Iran says it will retaliate against the U.S. They've, I think, reported that there's like 13 options that they're considering. I just want to, take a minute here to point out, I think there's a wide array of responses that Iran could take. They could be more political, trying to push the U.S. out of Iraq, getting the Iraqi parliament to take a stronger stance and make sure that American troops are expelled. It could be to continue to carry out these mortar attacks through Iraqi Shia militias against U.S. forces, who I'm sure after the killing of their deputy commander are going to be more incentivized than ever to, work with the Iraqis here. This is a point Ronnie Akalik made that I thought was really good, and that is everybody chalks all these forces up in the Middle East, Hezbollah, the Houthis, the Popular Mobilization Forces, Hamas, as being, just proxies of Iran. And that really isn't the case, any more than the Saudis are maybe a proxies of the Americans. We're willing to arm them, and we have some influence for that reason over what Saudi Arabia does, but ultimately Saudi Arabia made Saudi Arabia's choices. And, she kind of points out that in all these cases, it's not like Iran, Soleimani could say to whatever Iraqi Shia militia he wanted, now you shoot this American here, and they're just going to go out and do it. The leader of Hezbollah put out a statement saying that Americans have become targets now in the Middle East, but points out that, they should limit their killing to American military personnel and not attack American civilians. In the range of Iranian responses, I think proxy forces taking shots at American and generally the political motive to try to push U.S. forces out of Iraq, which also may cause at least a withdrawal from U.S. forces in eastern Syria, is going to be the kind of where the Iran is pointing the finger. It's possible, but I doubt they, take a direct, maybe missile strike at an American target somewhere. Iran announced since the killing of Soleimani that it will no longer comply with any of the restrictions imposed and agreed to by Iran through the JCPOA. That's the nuclear deal. This was a good deal that the Americans withdrew from. Once the Americans withdrew, it activated part of the agreement, which allows the Iranians to also take steps to withdraw their commitments to the deal, because it doesn't make sense from the Iranian perspectives to stay within an agreement when the Americans are sanctioning you, because then, as the Trump administration has pointed out, it harms the Iranian economy. And the point of Iran agreeing to the JCPOA was for their economy to improve. Now, I believe Iran is still in the nuclear deal. They're not in technically violation of it by the letter of the deal. Now, some people will say they're in violation of parts of the agreement and things that they said that they were going to do. And technically, it's true. They did say they wouldn't enrich uranium past 3.6%, but this was after the other side already broke the deal. And so if the Americans reduce sanctions, get back in the deal and act fairly, maybe the Iranians then, under the interpretation of the deal, see that now that everybody's complying with it, then they have to return to their commitments and, go bad, shut off some centrifuges, stuff like that. I don't think this is just a response to Soleimani being killed. Maybe this got moved up in a little bit of time, but this was a threat that Iran had long made. And again, it's because Trump withdrew from the JCPOA. Lots of Americans are getting out of Iraq these days. The U.S. is urging all citizens to leave. U.S. oil workers in southern cities and now northern areas, the Kurdish areas, are withdrawing. The U.S. is redeploying forces around Iraq, different forces here and there. A couple of U.S. allies, NATO allies, including Germany, are moving their forces, at least a portion of their forces, out of Iraq into other countries. Kuwait and Jordan, Croatia and Serbia are removing a total of 21 troops. The U.S. is deploying a task force of Army Rangers, an entire battalion of paratroopers, and 6 B-52 bombers to Diego Garcia. All these troops are moving into the region now, so a lot going on with troop movements and stuff like that. I'm going to try to keep up on it. Sometimes they use like rotational things, like it just happens that, this squadron B-52s was set to go to Iran on January 5th. And when they showed up that day, everybody took pictures like it was a big deal. But it's really just, the typical military force in the region. I know that the U.S. had deployed B-52s to Qatar in May, but those had since come home. In the days after the strike, Trump took to Twitter, one, to make a threat to the Iranians, to strike 52 Iranian targets, including cultural targets, if Iran responds after the assassination of Soleimani. Now, Mark Esper, the Secretary of Defense, did say that the Pentagon might not go along if Trump is ordering us to commit war crimes So there's a little bit of a difference there. I think Pompeo also said that the U.S. wouldn't commit war crimes, but striking a cultural site would be equivalent to a war crime, as would waging an aggressive war, which Trump did by blowing up Soleimani in the first place. And both, Pompeo apparently pushed it, and Esper at least went along with it. So it seems like they are willing to commit war crimes at the direction of the president. Trump did give a report to Congress about the strike, but the entire thing is classified, so I have no idea about that. Speaker Pelosi said that she's going to introduce a resolution to limit Trump's war-making powers. We'll see if there's enough senators with courage to vote against this. I'm a little bit skeptical that this will amount to anything. Trump vetoed the Yemen War Powers resolution, so I'm guessing he'll veto this one as well. I can't imagine we'll get super majorities in each house to override that veto. All the same, it's pretty clear by the Constitution that he needs a declaration of war, not an absence of one, to be able to do this. And it's just unfortunate. Congress actually had this in the NDAA for 2020 that was passed by the House, a limitation on Trump's war-making powers with Iran, saying that he can use no funding for that. And, that was stripped out of the bill, unfortunately. And, I should say, as I said at the time, that, the Trump administration would take that as a green light that they can do military action against Iran, since Congress didn't say that they couldn't and actually stripped that legislation out of the bill. And, look what happens now. We're carrying out attacks against Iran. Trump did send out another tweet that was quite interesting, saying that this was him informing Congress that he intends or could respond to Iran by carrying out military strikes against them. I don't know if that actually legally counts for anything, but that is just one of the very interesting things in the era of Trump, is that some things are really just out there. And so I'm excited that at least this was, just that transparent. And the American people, now we know who Trump is. He's a warmonger just like the rest of them. He told us on Twitter. And, a little bit of good news in the U.S. There were quite a few protests. I saw a good number of people at some of them holding up signs, no war with Iran, remove the sanctions. Some people really seem to understand the dangers here and why we cannot have this happen. In Iraq, over the weekend, there were several reports of different rockets hitting different areas around Baghdad. I wasn't able to really nail down any of them. I saw a lot of pictures that looked like rocket strikes that hit here or there. It does seem that a couple hit Baghdad, around the green zone, but nothing actually of America, and actually who, fired off these rockets wasn't clear either. The response in Iraq was condemnation from pretty much every Iraqi official that I heard. Even the, Sunni and Kurdish politicians both condemned the killing of these Shia men on Iraqi soil. And Iraq's parliament voted in a resolution that was, I believe, all Shia votes. I don't know if any Kurds or Sunnis actually voted for it. That calls for the American troops to be kicked out of Iraq. Well, actually, all foreign forces, I believe it says. But there's no, strict deadlines or dates in it, so it seems a little bit symbolic to me at this point. Now, Sunday or Monday, I think it was Monday afternoon, this Department of Defense memo leaked that made it sound like American forces were leaving Iraq. And I was surprised by the news and very skeptical. A couple hours later, Mark Esper clarified that this was a draft of a memo that was itself not released and was just informing the Iraqi government of more U.S. troops being moved around. All right, that's all I have on Soleimani for now. I'm pretty sure I'm going to have more on the next show. In Kenya, Al-Shabaab, this is, I would say, a pretty local to Somalia group. They have sworn loyalty to Al-Qaeda, but they're not like Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula that plots tats on Western countries. So just to say, I don't think Al-Shabaab is like Osama bin Laden disciples to start this off, but they do have regional issues. They are trying to control a large section of Somalia. At one point, they even controlled the capital city, but now, if you look at a map, at least, I'm not sure what the population is in the area, but the lower third of the country is what they control. The United States, along with the, government in place in Somalia that's backed by, the international governments, the African Union, has deployed their, Somali forces, including, former battalions and generals, of Al-Shabaab against, the Al-Shabaab and the people of the region controlled, by their country. The U.S. has carried out airstrikes there. And then the African Union forces have operated and, carried out atrocities in the area. And Al-Shabaab, just like all these other insurgent groups, fight back asymmetrically. This time they carried out an attack on Kenyan military base. Apparently they ransacked the thing, destroyed some planes, and killed one American soldier and 2 American contractors. See, it's kind of interesting here. And I'm not saying this because I want Trump to have some big reaction and carpet bomb Somalia. But they try to make it sound like, well, the U.S. had to do this in response to, some guys going into our embassy. And an American contractor was killed at an Iraqi base by some group that has some loose ties to Iran. And here you have Al-Shabaab that controls territory in Somalia, ransacks a Kenyan base, kills 3 Americans, and you don't have this massive response from Trump. And so clearly this is, I think, a part of Trump's larger game against Iran and just the dangerous, stupid Iran hots that are in the Trump administration influencing him here, where, they don't know or care enough about Africa to really plan any kind of response. I'm sure the U.S. will carry out some extra drone or airstrikes in Somalia over the coming weeks. I'm sure the United States is going to report that they, neutralized or took out X number of Al-Shabaab militants, X number of Al-Qaeda militants, and report no civilian casualties. However, you can't trust the DOD on these numbers. Every time actual reporters get on the ground in there, they come to find that civilians were killed in these attacks. Al-Shabaab carried out another attack in Kenya. This one was an attack on a telecommunications mast, and apparently 3 children were killed in the crossfire. So Al-Shabaab, not a noble and righteous group, but is, at war with the Americans. And it's important for Americans to realize that, every now and then there are going to be casualties on the American side of this war. And we really need to decide whether it's worth it to fight us or not, especially if these aren't people that never plan on coming across the Atlantic Ocean and killing Americans. In Libya, there are 2 or 3 big events here. Turkey said that they will begin deploying forces to assist the Libyan government. This is the UN-recognized Government of National Accord, often goes by the initials GNA. The opposition military/government is headed up by the general or head of the army, Khalifa Haftar, and that is the Libyan National Army, or the LNA. The LNA carried out an airstrike in Tripoli against the military academy, killing 33. So, this represents the GNA is in trouble. The Turkish militia or military is now coming in to support them. There's been reports of Turkey redeploying radical fighters from Syria, these Sunni extremist types over to Libya, maybe 200 or so are already in the country, and now they've deployed some military advisors. Apparently, Haftar's forces, the LNA, which is right now fighting a battle for the capital city, also decided to take a major city in Libya, and that is Sirte. It's the former home of the longtime leader of Libya, Muammar Gaddafi. In 2016, it was taken over by the Islamic State. Right at the end of the Obama term, I believe he dropped a total of 499 bombs on the city to help the GNA's forces liberate it from the Islamic State, and now it has been taken over by the LNA. A couple big tragedies happened in the Sahel region of Africa, and most of these tragedies are unfolding as blowback from the U.S. war in Libya. 14 students were killed when their bus hit a explosive device of some kind in Burkina Faso. It's unclear who planted this explosive device. In Nigeria, 30 people were killed on a crowded bridge when a bomb exploded. It's unclear who carried out the attack, but Boko Haram is suspected. All right, everybody. I hope you're enjoying the show. Share it. Go to thelibertarianinstitute.org, find my news roundup, find the show on the homepage, click the share button. Patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus, at KYAAALE on Twitter, and Facebook has a private Facebook group, Foreign Policy Focus. Thanks, everyone.